I used to believe that family meant unconditional love, that no matter how badly you stumbled or how far you fell, there would always be a place at the table waiting for you. I was wrong. Sometimes the people who are supposed to catch you when you're falling are the ones who push you off the cliff. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how my parents' rejection became the catalyst for the most meaningful Thanksgiving of my life. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the pristine suburbs of Westfield, Connecticut, I was the poster child for perfection. Honor roll student, debate team captain, homecoming queen, full scholarship to Boston University. My parents, Robert and Margaret Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 80s with nothing but determination and a suitcase full of dreams. They built their American success story from the ground up, starting with my father's small accounting firm that eventually grew into a respected financial consulting business, serving half the wealthy families in Fairfield County. Their success came at a price, though. Every achievement had to be documented, every milestone had to be worthy of their Christmas card. I learned early that love in the Chen household was conditional, measured in GPAs and accomplishments, in how well I reflected their journey from struggling immigrants to established Americans. My younger brother David understood this too, becoming a surgeon just as our parents had always envisioned, marrying his medical school sweetheart in a ceremony that made the society pages. I thought I had cracked the code when I met Jonathan Whitmore during my senior year at BU. He was everything my parents had ever dreamed of for me. Harvard Law Review, family money dating back to the Mayflower, connections that could open doors I didn't even know existed. When we got engaged after my graduation, my mother cried tears of joy for the first time I could remember. This wasn't just a marriage, she told her friends at the country club. This was the completion of their American dream. The wedding was a spectacle that my parents still talk about as the pinnacle of their social achievement. 400 guests, designer everything, a venue that cost more than most people's houses. The photos showed the perfect couple, me in my custom Vera Wang gown, Jonathan in his family's ancestral tuxedo, my parents beaming with pride as they welcomed their new son-in-law into what they called the family legacy. For once I felt like I had earned their unconditional approval. The early years of marriage felt like living inside a magazine spread. Jonathan's law practice flourished. I built a successful career in nonprofit development. We bought a beautiful colonial in Greenwich, played tennis at the country club on weekends, hosted dinner parties that were featured in local lifestyle publications. My parents would beam when they introduced me to their friends, their voices swelling with pride as they talked about their daughter's perfect life. But perfection, I learned, is like walking on ice that gets thinner with every step. The cracks started small. Jonathan worked later and later, claiming that making partner required sacrifices. Our conversations became exchanges of schedules rather than dreams. The intimacy we'd shared in college faded into polite coexistence, two people sharing a beautiful house but living separate lives. I threw myself deeper into my work, finding meaning in helping nonprofits raise funds for causes that mattered. I specialized in organizations supporting women and children, perhaps sensing even then that I would need the strength these causes represented. My proudest achievement was helping to raise $3 million for a domestic violence shelter, working with women who had found the courage to rebuild their lives from nothing. The irony wasn't lost on me later, that I was helping other women find their strength while I was slowly losing mine. Jonathan and I tried counseling, expensive retreats, even planned a second honeymoon to Italy, hoping that romance could resurrect what routine had buried. But you can't force love back to life, through geographic location or therapeutic intervention. We were like two actors who had forgotten their lines but kept pretending the show was still running. The night everything fell apart started like any other. Jonathan came home late from what he said was a client dinner, but something felt different. He was distant in a way that went beyond exhaustion, carrying guilt like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. I found the credit card statement 3 days later, tucked inside his briefcase that he'd left open on his desk. 5-star hotel charges, expensive restaurant bills, purchases at jewelry stores I'd never been to, all on dates when he'd told me he was working late or traveling for business. Confronting him felt like stepping off a cliff. I'd built my entire identity around being the perfect wife and the perfect marriage that made my parents proud. Admitting that it was all a lie meant admitting that I'd failed at the one thing I thought I'd finally gotten right. But the evidence was undeniable, and when I laid it out on our kitchen table that Thursday evening, Jonathan didn't even try to deny it. Her name was Rebecca, she was a paralegal at his firm, 26 years old. Everything I used to be before life taught me that dreams and reality rarely align. He said it started as friendship, evolved into emotional support, became physical almost without him realizing it. He said he never meant for it to happen, that he still cared about me, that he was confused and lost and didn't know how to fix what we'd broken. I listened to his explanations, his apologies, his promises that he would end it and we could work things out. But as he spoke, I realized I wasn't heartbroken the way I should have been. I was relieved. The pretending could finally stop. The exhausting performance of perfection could end. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. That relief lasted exactly 18 hours, until I called my parents to tell them what was happening. My mother's silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice. "What did you do wrong, Sarah? Marriages don't just fall apart, there must be something you're not telling us." My father's response was even worse. "This is about appearances, Sarah. Think about what this does to our family's reputation. Can't you work it out quietly? See a therapist, take a vacation, do whatever it takes to fix this before people start talking." They didn't ask how I was feeling, they didn't offer support or sympathy, they didn't even express anger at Jonathan for betraying their daughter. Their first and only concern was how my divorce would reflect on them, how it would look to their friends at the country club, what people would whisper at the next charity gala. When I told them that I'd already contacted a lawyer, that Jonathan and I had agreed to proceed with an amicable divorce, my mother actually gasped like I'd announced a terminal diagnosis. "Sarah Elizabeth Chen, you cannot be serious. Do you have any idea what this means? Your brother is about to make chief of surgery. This is not the time for family scandal." Family scandal, that's what my marriage falling apart represented to them. Not their daughter's pain or disappointment, or the courage it took to walk away from a life that looked perfect from the outside. It was a scandal, an embarrassment, a stain on the family name they'd spent decades polishing. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. Jonathan was fair about the division of assets, probably motivated by guilt and his eagerness to start fresh with Rebecca. I kept the house initially, thinking I could rebuild my life in familiar surroundings, but every room held memories of the woman I'd been when I thought I had everything figured out. The silence was deafening. In a house designed for entertaining couples, I rattled around like a marble in an empty jar. My parents' disappointment hung over everything like smoke. They didn't cut contact completely, but their calls became obligatory check-ins filled with thinly veiled criticism. Why hadn't I tried harder? Why couldn't I have been more understanding? Why did I have to be so dramatic about everything? Their friends, they informed me, were asking uncomfortable questions. The Pemberton family had mentioned seeing Jonathan around town with a young woman. The Watsons had heard rumors. Everyone wanted to know what had really happened, and my parents clearly blamed me for putting them in this position. By the time October rolled around, I was living in a new apartment downtown, finally having sold the house that had become a monument to my failed marriage. I'd thrown myself back into work with renewed passion, helping launch a new initiative for single mothers re-entering the workforce. For the first time in years, I felt useful, like my life had purpose beyond maintaining appearances. That's when my mother called about Thanksgiving. I was in my office, reviewing grant applications for women's literacy programs, when her name appeared on my phone screen. We hadn't spoken in 2 weeks, and our last conversation had ended with her suggesting that perhaps I should consider moving to a different town, somewhere I could start fresh without carrying baggage that affects the family. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying that formal tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news. "Your father and I have been discussing Thanksgiving arrangements." I assumed she was calling to coordinate timing, to figure out what dish I should bring, to plan the family gathering that had been a tradition for as long as I could remember. The Chen family Thanksgiving was legendary in our circle. My mother spent weeks preparing, turning our dining room into something worthy of a magazine photo shoot. Extended family flew in from California, longtime family friends were always invited, and everything had to be perfect down to the last detail. "We've decided," she continued, that it would be better if you didn't come this year. The words hit me like cold water. I actually laughed, thinking she was joking. What do you mean, didn't come? It's Thanksgiving, Mom. It's our family tradition. Exactly. It's about family, and right now, your situation is. She paused, searching for the right words. It's complicated. Your presence would raise questions we're not prepared to answer. David and Jennifer are bringing the grandchildren, and we don't want them exposed to awkwardness. Uncle William and Aunt Grace are flying in from San Francisco, and they don't know about your divorce yet. It's just not the right time. I sat in my office chair, staring out at the Hartford skyline, trying to process what she was saying. My own mother was uninviting me from Thanksgiving, because my divorce was too embarrassing to explain to relatives and family friends. I was being treated like a family secret, something shameful that needed to be hidden away until it became more socially acceptable. You're telling me I can't come to Thanksgiving because I got divorced? My voice sounded strange, like it was coming from someone else. Don't be dramatic, Sarah. This is temporary. Once things settle down, once you figure out your next steps, once the talk dies down, we can get back to normal family gatherings. But right now, your father and I need to protect the family's interests. The family's interests, not my interests. Not my emotional well-being. Not the fact that I was spending my first holiday season alone after my marriage imploded. The family's interests meant their social standing, their reputation, their comfort in not having to explain their daughter's failure to their carefully curated social circle. I asked her if she was serious. She assured me she was. I asked her what I was supposed to do for Thanksgiving, and she suggested I might use the time to reflect on my choices, and maybe reach out to some of my single friends who probably didn't have family obligations. Single friends. As if divorce was contagious, as if I'd been relegated to some separate category of person who could no longer participate in normal family life. The conversation ended with her promising to call me after the holidays to see how I was doing. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she was being generous by maintaining any contact at all with her scandalous divorced daughter. I hung up the phone and sat in my office for a long time, watching people walk past my window, heading home to their families, their normal lives, their places at tables where they belonged without question. For the first time since my divorce was finalized, I cried. Not for Jonathan, not for my marriage, but for the family I thought I had, the unconditional love I'd believed was waiting for me no matter what happened in my life. That night I called my brother David. We'd never been particularly close, separated by 4 years in age and vastly different personalities, but I thought he might understand, might offer some perspective or at least some sibling solidarity. Sarah, he said, when he heard my voice, I was wondering if you'd call. You know about Thanksgiving. Mom mentioned they thought it might be better to keep things low-key this year. Look, I'm sorry about what happened with Jonathan, but you have to understand their perspective. They're getting older, they've worked hard for their reputation in this community, and right now, things are just.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Embarrassing? I finished for him. Complicated, he corrected, but we both knew what he meant. David explained that his wife Jennifer was pregnant with their third child, that the family was dealing with a lot of transition, that maybe it was better for everyone if this year was just immediate family. He promised that things would get back to normal once the dust settled, once I figured out what came next in my life. Once I figured out what came next, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person going through a difficult time. I realized that night that I had become a stranger in my own family. The divorce hadn't just ended my marriage, it had apparently ended my membership in the Chen family unit. I was now an outsider. Someone whose very existence threatened the perfect image they'd spent decades crafting. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of work and solitude. I threw myself into helping prepare Thanksgiving meals at the local homeless shelter, finding solace in serving people who appreciated kindness without conditions. I accepted every work project offered to me, staying late in the office to avoid going home to my empty apartment where the silence reminded me of everything I'd lost. My friends rallied around me as much as they could, but most of them had their own family obligations for the holiday. Besides, I wasn't ready to explain the full extent of my family's rejection. It felt too pathetic, too unbelievable. Who gets uninvited from their own family's Thanksgiving dinner? As November progressed, I found myself thinking more and more about the people I'd met through my work over the years. The other divorced women I'd encountered at fundraising events, the single mothers I'd helped connect with job training programs, the elderly volunteers who spent their holidays serving others because their own families lived far away or had forgotten about them. I started to realize that family wasn't just about blood relations or marriage certificates or maintaining appearances for the country club crowd. Family was about the people who showed up when life got difficult, who offered support without conditions, who valued your humanity over your social status. That's when the idea hit me. If my parents wanted to protect their perfect Thanksgiving from the contamination of my divorce, fine, I would create my own Thanksgiving, one based on genuine connection rather than social obligation. I would invite the people who had been real family to me over the years, the ones who had shown up during my divorce when my blood relatives had turned away. I started making a list, and I was surprised by how long it became. Margaret Wilson, the 68-year-old volunteer coordinator at the women's shelter, whose husband had died 2 years ago and whose children lived across the country. James and Patricia Reeves, the couple who ran the nonprofit literacy program I'd helped fund, both retired teachers who'd never had children but had devoted their lives to educating others. Carmen Rodriguez, the single mother I'd mentored through our job placement program, who was working 2 jobs to support her teenage daughter while finishing her accounting degree. The list grew. Linda Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, a widow who'd started a support group for divorced women over 50. Robert Martinez, the retired firefighter who volunteered at 3 different charities and whose adult children were too busy with their own lives to make time for their father. Susan Park, my former neighbor who'd brought me casseroles during my divorce proceedings, and whose own family treated her like an obligation rather than a blessing. These were people who understood struggle, who knew what it meant to rebuild your life from disappointment, who had learned that the most meaningful connections often come from shared vulnerability rather than shared genetics. I decided to invite them all. But I wanted to do more than just host a regular dinner. I wanted to create something that would honor the true spirit of Thanksgiving, something that would celebrate resilience and chosen family and the courage it takes to build new traditions when old ones fail you. That's when I remembered something my mother had mentioned during our painful phone conversation. The guest list for their family Thanksgiving, Uncle William and Aunt Grace flying in from San Francisco. The Pemberton family, whose son had always been held up as an example of what I should aspire to marry. The Watsons, who owned the largest furniture store chain in Connecticut and had been family friends for 20 years. The Chens from Stamford, my father's business associates who shared our surname and often got invited to family events as a result. These weren't just random family friends. These were the pillars of my parents' social circle, the people whose opinions mattered most to them, the audience for their carefully orchestrated life performance. What if, I thought, some of those same people received invitations to a different kind of Thanksgiving dinner? The idea was audacious, probably crazy, and definitely the kind of thing that would horrify my parents if they found out. But as I sat in my apartment that evening, surrounded by the quiet that had become my constant companion, I realized I didn't care anymore about horrifying my parents. They had already made it clear that their comfort mattered more than my well-being. I spent the next evening crafting invitations, not just to the people on my original list, but to a few carefully selected members of my parents' social circle. People I'd known since childhood, who had watched me grow up, who might be interested in a different kind of holiday celebration. The Pemberton family, whose son Michael had indeed become the successful surgeon my parents always held up as an example, but whose marriage had also recently ended in a quiet divorce that was being kept very private. Mrs. Watson, whose husband had died unexpectedly the year before, and who was facing her first major holiday as a widow. Dr. and Mrs. Park, family friends who had immigrated from Korea around the same time as my parents, and had always been kind to me, but whose own children lived on the West Coast and rarely visited. I crafted the invitations carefully, explaining that I was hosting a Thanksgiving dinner for people who believed in the importance of chosen family, of supporting each other through life's unexpected turns, of celebrating gratitude and resilience rather than just abundance and tradition. I didn't mention that my parents had uninvited me from their dinner. I didn't explain the family drama or try to gain sympathy. I simply invited them to join me for what I promised would be a meaningful and intimate celebration of what Thanksgiving could be when it focused on genuine connection rather than social obligation. The responses started coming in within days, and they surprised me. Not just the acceptances, though there were more of those than I'd expected, but the personal notes people included with their replies. Mrs. Watson wrote that she'd been dreading spending the holiday alone and was grateful for the invitation to be part of something meaningful. The Parks mentioned that they'd been feeling disconnected from their community since their children moved away and were excited to spend the holiday with people who understood the immigrant experience of building new traditions in a new country. Even Michael Pemberton responded, saying that he'd been planning to spend Thanksgiving alone since his own divorce had left him estranged from his ex-wife's family traditions, and that he would welcome the chance to be around people who understood that life doesn't always go according to plan. Carmen Rodriguez called me personally to thank me for the invitation, explaining that she'd been worried about being able to afford a proper Thanksgiving dinner for her daughter this year, and that being invited to contribute a dish rather than host an entire meal was a blessing she hadn't expected. As the RSVPs came in, I realized I was creating something I'd never experienced before, a community based on authenticity rather than obligation, on mutual support rather than social positioning, on celebrating who we were rather than pretending to be who we thought we should be. But the most surprising response came from someone I hadn't even invited. The call came on a Tuesday evening, while I was reviewing catering menus, trying to figure out how to feed 23 people without bankrupting myself. The number on my phone was one I recognized but hadn't seen in months. "Sarah, it's Jennifer." My sister-in-law's voice was hesitant, almost guilty. We'd spoken briefly at family gatherings over the years, but never had what I'd call real conversations. She was David's wife first, the mother of my parents' grandchildren second, and my connection to her had always been filtered through family obligations rather than genuine friendship. "Jennifer, hi, is everything okay? Is David all right?" "He's fine, we're all fine, She paused, and I could hear children's voices in the background, probably my nephew and niece arguing over toys or television shows. "I heard about Thanksgiving, about what happened with your parents." My stomach tightened. Of course she knew. She was part of the inner circle now, privy to family decisions that apparently no longer included me. "David told you." "He did. And Sarah, I want you to know that I disagree with their choice. Strongly. This was not what I'd expected." Jennifer had always struck me as someone who avoided conflict, who went along with family decisions to keep the peace. She was the perfect daughter-in-law, agreeing with my parents' opinions, praising their wisdom, fitting seamlessly into their vision of what our family should be. I appreciate that, but it's their house, their decision. I can't force them to want me there. "That's not why I'm calling." Jennifer's voice grew stronger, more determined. "I'm calling because I want you to know that not everyone in this family agrees with how you're being treated. And I'm calling because I heard something interesting from Patricia Pemberton today at the grocery store." Patricia Pemberton. Michael's mother, one of the women I'd invited to my alternative Thanksgiving dinner. She mentioned that she'd received an invitation to a Thanksgiving dinner you're hosting. She seemed quite excited about it actually. Said it sounded like exactly what she needed this year, something more meaningful than the usual social obligations. I felt my cheeks burn. Word was getting around, which meant it would eventually get back to my parents. I'd known this was a possibility when I sent the invitations, but hearing it confirmed made my stomach churn with anxiety and something that might have been anticipation. "Sarah, I think what you're doing is brave. Creating your own tradition, bringing together people who actually want to be there, rather than people who feel obligated to show up. I wish I had that kind of courage." "What do you mean?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. "Do you know what it's like to spend every family gathering feeling like you're being evaluated? Like every word you say is being measured against some invisible standard of what the perfect daughter-in-law should be. Your parents have been wonderful to me in many ways, but I've never felt like I could just be myself around them. Everything has to be performance." This was a side of Jennifer I'd never seen, and it made me realize how little I actually knew about what her life was like within our family structure. I'd always assumed she was comfortable with the expectations, that she thrived on meeting their standards the way I'd once tried to do. I envy what you're doing, she continued. Building something real instead of just maintaining appearances. David doesn't understand it, and neither do your parents, but I think you're creating something beautiful. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the growing pile of recipes and shopping lists, feeling a strange mix of validation and terror. What I was doing was starting to feel bigger than just hosting a dinner. It was becoming a statement, a declaration of independence from a family system that had never really valued me for who I was. The next morning brought another unexpected phone call, this one from Margaret Wilson, the volunteer coordinator from the women's shelter. Sarah, dear, I've been thinking about your invitation, and I have a proposition for you. Margaret had the kind of voice that commanded attention without ever being loud, the voice of someone who'd spent decades managing volunteers and coordinating complex charitable events. When she had an idea, people listened. I mentioned your dinner to some of the other volunteers, and several of them are facing difficult holidays this year too. Would you be open to expanding your guest list a bit more? I'm thinking specifically of Eleanor Rodriguez. She's Carmen's aunt, just lost her husband 6 months ago, and is dreading spending the holiday alone. And Thomas Chen, he's not related to you despite the name. He's been volunteering with us since his wife passed last year. Before I knew it, Margaret was offering to help coordinate the entire event. She had connections with local farms for fresh ingredients, relationships with party rental companies, who might donate tables and chairs, and most importantly, experience organizing events that brought people together in meaningful ways. What you're doing, Sarah, is exactly what Thanksgiving should be about. Not performance, not social climbing, not maintaining appearances. Community, real community, built on shared values rather than shared last names, or shared bank account balances. By the end of our conversation, my simple dinner had evolved into something much more ambitious. Margaret was coordinating with 3 other volunteers to handle decorations and setup. Carmen was bringing her famous tres leches cake, and her aunt's traditional Mexican stuffing recipe. Robert Martinez was offering to bring his legendary smoked turkey, the one that had made him famous among his fellow firefighters. Each phone call brought new energy to the project, but also new anxiety about what my parents would think when they inevitably found out. Because they would find out. In a community like Westfield, where social circles overlapped and information traveled faster than gossip, there was no way to keep something like this secret. That anxiety became reality sooner than I'd expected. I was at the grocery store on Thursday afternoon, loading my cart with cranberries and sweet potatoes, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Sarah Chen, what a surprise. I turned to see Vivian Watson, the widow I'd invited to dinner, standing with her shopping cart, and an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Watson, how are you doing? Am well, dear.
Actually, I'm looking forward to your dinner next week. It's been a long time since I've had something to anticipate for the holidays. She moved closer, lowering her voice. I hope you don't mind me saying, but I ran into your mother at the bank yesterday. My heart stopped. Oh, she mentioned that you wouldn't be joining them for Thanksgiving this year, that you had other plans. She seemed quite concerned about what those other plans might be. This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and secretly hoping for. My parents knew I was doing something, even if they didn't know exactly what yet. What did you tell her? Vivian Watson smiled, and there was something almost mischievous in her expression. I told her that I thought it was wonderful that you were creating your own traditions, and that anyone who knew you would consider themselves lucky to spend a holiday in your company. I felt tears prick at my eyes. This woman, who barely knew me beyond our interactions at charity events, had defended me to my own mother. She didn't seem particularly pleased with that response. Vivian continued. But Sarah dear, I want you to know that what you're doing takes tremendous courage. When my husband died, I learned very quickly who my real friends were. They weren't necessarily the people I'd known the longest, or the ones who belonged to the same clubs. They were the ones who showed up when things got difficult. Walking home from the grocery store, my arms full of bags and my mind full of Vivian's words, I realized that my alternative Thanksgiving was becoming something I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just a reaction to my parents' rejection anymore. It was becoming a celebration of the community I'd been building without even realizing it, the network of people who had supported me not because they were obligated to, but because they chose to. But it was also becoming something that would force a confrontation with my family, whether I wanted one or not. That confrontation came sooner than I expected, in the form of my brother David showing up at my apartment on Friday evening, unannounced and clearly uncomfortable. "We need to talk," he said, when I opened the door, his doctor voice in full effect, the tone he probably used to deliver difficult diagnoses. I let him in, offered him coffee, made small talk about his kids and his work while we both avoided the real reason he was there. Finally, he set down his mug and looked at me directly. "Mom and Dad know about your dinner." I figured they would eventually. "They're not happy, Sarah. They're actually pretty upset." I waited for him to continue, not trusting myself to respond without saying something I'd regret. "They feel like you're deliberately trying to embarrass them, inviting their friends to some kind of alternative event when you know they're hosting their own family dinner. They think you're trying to make a point at their expense." "What point would that be, exactly?" David shifted uncomfortably. "That they're shallow, or fake, or that their version of family isn't good enough for you." I stared at him, wondering if he really didn't understand what had happened, or if he was just choosing to interpret it in a way that made our parents' behavior seem reasonable. "David, they told me not to come to Thanksgiving because my divorce was too embarrassing to explain to their friends. They uninvited me from our family dinner because my failed marriage might make people uncomfortable. And now they're upset because I made other plans instead of sitting home alone feeling sorry for myself." You have to understand their position, Sarah. They've worked hard to build relationships in this community. Their reputation matters to them. And what about my feelings? Do those matter at all? David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Of course they do. But you're strong, Sarah. You always have been. You'll get through this and move on and rebuild your life. They're older, and their social standing is more fragile." I felt something crack inside my chest. My own brother was essentially telling me that my parents' social comfort was more important than my emotional well-being, that my strength was a reason to deprioritize my needs, rather than a quality to be celebrated. So because I'm strong enough to handle being rejected by my family, that makes it okay. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. You're all so convinced that I'm fine, that I can handle anything, that you've forgotten I'm a human being who needs support too. Just because I'm not falling apart publicly doesn't mean I'm not hurting. David tried to salvage the conversation, explaining that our parents were worried about me, that they wanted what was best for me, that they hoped I would reconsider my plans, and maybe find a quieter way to spend the holiday. "They sent you here to ask me to cancel my dinner. They sent me here to talk to you about finding a compromise." "What kind of compromise?" "Maybe you could have a small dinner with a few close friends, people who don't overlap with their social circle. Maybe you could wait until Christmas to start new traditions, give everyone time to adjust to your situation." My situation, as if my divorce was a temporary condition that everyone needed time to process rather than a life change that deserved respect and support. I walked David to the door, promising to think about what he'd said, but we both knew I wasn't going to change my plans. I'd already bought the food, sent the invitations, accepted people's contributions and commitments. More importantly, I'd discovered something in the planning of this dinner that I hadn't felt in years. Excitement about bringing people together, pride in creating something meaningful, joy in building community based on authenticity rather than appearance. Saturday morning brought a phone call I'd been half expecting and completely dreading. "Sarah, it's your mother." Her voice was crisp, businesslike, the tone she used when she was about to deliver an ultimatum. "I think we need to discuss what you're planning for next week. What would you like to discuss? I understand you've invited some of our friends to a dinner at your apartment." Our friends, not my friends, not people I'd known since childhood, but their friends, people whose loyalty belonged to my parents rather than to me. "I've invited people I care about to share Thanksgiving dinner with me." "Yes, Sarah, this puts people in a very awkward position. Patricia Pemberton called me yesterday. Quite upset about receiving an invitation from you, when she knows we're hosting our own family dinner the same day. She didn't know how to respond without seeming rude to either of us." I doubted Patricia Pemberton had been upset. Her acceptance email had been enthusiastic, mentioning how much she was looking forward to a more intimate celebration than the usual large family gatherings that left everyone feeling obligated rather than grateful. I'm sorry if people feel caught in the middle, but I'm not trying to compete with your dinner. I'm trying to create my own tradition with people who want to be there. People who want to be there. My mother's voice sharpened. Are you implying that the people coming to our dinner don't want to be there? Are you suggesting that family obligations are somehow less meaningful than whatever it is you think you're creating? The conversation spiraled from there, with my mother listing all the ways my dinner was inappropriate, inconsiderate, and deliberately hurtful to the family. I was being selfish, she said. I was making my divorce everyone else's problem. I was forcing people to choose sides in a conflict that didn't need to exist. There doesn't have to be a conflict, Mom. You can have your dinner, and I can have mine. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Of course they're mutually exclusive, Sarah. You've invited our friends to your dinner instead of coming to ours. You're creating division where there doesn't need to be any. I created division. I'm not the one who uninvited family members from Thanksgiving. The line went quiet for a long moment, and when my mother spoke again, her voice was cold and final. We tried to protect you from an uncomfortable situation, and this is how you repay us. By embarrassing us in front of people whose opinions matter to us. I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my kitchen, with the phone in my hand and the realization that I'd just crossed a line I could never uncross. Sunday passed in a blur of preparation and second-guessing. I cleaned my apartment obsessively, rearranged furniture to accommodate more people, practiced conversation topics in my head to avoid awkward silences. But underneath all the practical planning was a growing certainty that what I was doing was right, regardless of my family's reaction. Margaret Wilson arrived Monday morning with a carload of volunteers and enough energy to power a small city. Within hours, my modest apartment had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, but better, because it felt real. Mismatched chairs that somehow worked perfectly together, wild flowers from Margaret's garden instead of expensive arrangements, handwritten place cards that included a brief note about why each person was special to the community we were creating. Tuesday brought final preparations and nervous energy that I channeled into cooking. Carmen arrived with her Aunt Eleanor, both of them carrying dishes that smelled like heaven and stories that made my kitchen feel like the center of the universe. Robert Martinez showed up with his famous turkey and tales from his firefighting days that had us all laughing until our sides hurt. By Wednesday evening, I was exhausted but exhilarated. My apartment was ready, the food was prepared, and I'd received final confirmations from 26 people who were as excited about tomorrow as I was nervous. That's when my doorbell rang at 9:30 in the evening. I opened the door to find my father standing in the hallway, looking older and more tired than I remembered. We stared at each other for a long moment before he asked if he could come in. Of course, Dad. He walked into my living room, taking in the decorated tables and carefully arranged seating, the handwritten place cards, and the flowers Margaret had insisted would make everything feel more welcoming. This is what you've been planning. This is it. He stood there for a long time, not saying anything, just looking around at what I'd created. Finally he sat down heavily in one of my mismatched chairs. Your mother is very upset. I know. She thinks you're doing this to hurt us. I sat down across from him, suddenly feeling like a child again, waiting for his verdict on whether I'd disappointed him or made him proud. I'm not doing this to hurt anyone, Dad. I'm doing this because I needed something to look forward to, and because there are people in this community who needed it too. People from our social circle, people who happen to be our neighbors and friends, yes, but also people you don't know, people who are spending their first holiday alone, people who understand what it's like to rebuild your life when everything falls apart. My father was quiet again, and I could see him processing this, trying to understand what I was really doing and why it threatened him and my mother so much. We didn't mean to hurt you, Sarah. About Thanksgiving, we thought we were protecting everyone from an uncomfortable situation. Whose comfort were you protecting, Dad? Because it wasn't mine. He looked down at his hands, and for the first time in our conversation, I saw something that might have been shame. We've never known how to handle failure, Sarah. Your mother and I, we built our lives around success, around having the right answers, around making everything look perfect from the outside. When your marriage fell apart, we didn't know how to support you, because we didn't know how to acknowledge that sometimes things don't work out the way we plan. This was more honesty than my father had ever offered me, and it left me unsure how to respond. We're proud of you, he continued. We've always been proud of you, but we're also scared of anything that threatens the stability we've worked so hard to create. Your divorce, your independence, your willingness to create something new instead of trying to fix something broken, it challenges everything we think we know about how life is supposed to work. I felt tears building in my eyes, not because of what he was saying, but because of what he wasn't saying. There was no apology for uninviting me from Thanksgiving.
There was no acknowledgement that their comfort shouldn't come at the expense of my well-being. There was no recognition that what I was creating was beautiful rather than threatening. Are you asking me to cancel tomorrow, Dad? He was quiet for a long time before answering. I'm asking you to understand why this is hard for us. And I'm asking you to understand why being rejected by my family was hard for me. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of years of misunderstanding settling between us like dust on old furniture. Finally, he stood up to leave. I hope your dinner goes well tomorrow, Sarah. I hope you find what you're looking for. After he left, I sat alone in my transformed living room, surrounded by evidence of the community I'd built and the relationships I'd chosen, wondering if this was what it felt like to finally grow up. Tomorrow would bring the dinner I'd planned, the people I'd invited, and the new tradition I was creating from the ashes of old disappointments. But it would also bring the final realization that some bridges burn completely, and that sometimes the only way forward is to build something entirely new from whatever materials you can find. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay in bed and pretend the world doesn't exist. But by 7 a.m., I was wide awake, staring at my ceiling and running through every possible disaster scenario my anxious brain could conjure. What if nobody showed up? What if the food was terrible? What if my parents decided to drive by and cause a scene? By 8, I was in my kitchen, channeling nervous energy into final preparations. The turkey Robert Martinez had delivered was already in the oven, filling my apartment with the kind of smell that makes everything feel like home. Margaret Wilson arrived at 9 with 2 other volunteers, transforming any remaining chaos into something that looked effortlessly elegant. The first guests began arriving at noon, and each knock on the door brought a fresh wave of both relief and terror. Carmen came with her Aunt Eleanor and her teenage daughter Sophia, all 3 of them carrying covered dishes and wearing smiles that could have powered the entire building. Thomas Chen arrived with a homemade apple pie that rivaled anything from the finest bakery, explaining quietly that baking had become his way of dealing with grief since his wife passed. By 1 o'clock, my small apartment was filled with 26 people who had somehow transformed from individual stories of loss and resilience into something that felt remarkably like family. The conversations flowed naturally, people finding connections they hadn't expected, sharing stories that ranged from hilarious to heartbreaking to profoundly hopeful. I was in the kitchen, basting the turkey one final time, when I heard a commotion near my front door. Voices I didn't recognize, someone explaining they were looking for Sarah Chen's apartment. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. Margaret appeared in my kitchen doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Sarah, dear, you have some unexpected visitors. I walked into my living room, to find my parents standing just inside my front door, looking completely out of place among my mismatched furniture and eclectic group of guests. My mother clutched her purse like a lifeline, her eyes scanning the room with the kind of expression she usually reserved for restaurants that didn't meet her standards. My father stood slightly behind her, his face unreadable. The room had gone quiet, not the awkward silence of people caught doing something wrong, but the watchful quiet of a community protecting one of its own. I could feel the support of everyone around me, even though most of them had no idea what kind of family drama was unfolding in front of them. Mom, Dad, I wasn't expecting you. My mother's voice was tight when she spoke. We decided we needed to see what was so important that it couldn't wait until after the holidays. I felt heat rise in my cheeks,
embarrassed for my guests who were witnessing this confrontation, angry at my parents for choosing this moment and this setting to make whatever point they'd come to make. Would you like to join us for dinner? I can set 2 more places. The offer surprised even me as it came out of my mouth, but something about being surrounded by people who had chosen to be there made me feel braver than I'd felt in months. My mother's laugh was sharp and humorless. Join you? Sarah, look around. Half the people in this room were supposed to be at our house today. Patricia Pemberton, the Watsons, even some people I don't recognize, but who I'm sure we've met at various community events. You've essentially stolen our guest list. The word stolen hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. I could see Patricia Pemberton shift uncomfortably in her chair, her face flushed with embarrassment at being put in this position. That's when Vivian Watson, all 5 feet of her, stood up and walked over to where my parents were standing. Margaret and Robert, she said, using their first names with the authority of someone who had known them for decades. I'm going to say something that needs to be said, and I hope you'll listen before you respond. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but Vivian held up one weathered hand. Your daughter invited me to spend this holiday with people who understand what it's like to rebuild your life when everything you thought you knew falls apart. She didn't steal me from your dinner table. She rescued me from spending today alone, pretending I was fine when I was actually drowning in grief and loneliness. She gestured around the room, where conversations had gradually resumed but everyone was still quietly listening. Look around this room, really look. Do you see people trying to hurt you? Or do you see people who needed something you weren't able to provide? Community without judgment, celebration without performance, gratitude without conditions. My father's expression had shifted from defensive to something that might have been curiosity. My mother still looked like she was preparing for battle. Sarah didn't create this dinner to embarrass you, Vivian continued. She created it because she needed it. We all needed it. And the fact that some of us happen to be people you know, says more about how small and interconnected our community is than it does about your daughter's motives. Patricia Pemberton stood up then, moving to stand beside Vivian. Margaret, I've known Sarah since she was in high school. I watched her win debate tournaments and graduate with honors and build a beautiful marriage that looked perfect from the outside. I also watched her handle her divorce with more grace and dignity than most people manage during the best times of their lives. She looked directly at my mother. When I received Sarah's invitation, I didn't think about whether it would conflict with your dinner. I thought about the fact that my own son is spending today alone in his apartment, too proud to admit that his divorce left him with nowhere to go for the holidays. I thought about the fact that I've been pretending to be fine since Richard died, when what I really needed was permission to acknowledge that some holidays are harder than others. More people began standing. Robert Martinez, who had never met my parents, but who understood family dysfunction from his years as a first responder. Eleanor Rodriguez, who spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had raised children and buried a husband and knew the difference between performance and genuine care. Your daughter, Eleanor said in accented English that carried more dignity than any society page photo, she has made something beautiful here. She has taken people who are hurting and given them a place to belong. This is what Thanksgiving should be. I watched my parents, as person after person, shared their perspective, their stories, their gratitude for being included in something that honored their humanity rather than their social status. My mother's defensive posture gradually softened, though her expression remained guarded. My father seemed to be genuinely listening, processing what he was hearing in a way I wasn't sure he'd ever processed anything about my life before. Finally, Carmen stepped forward. I'd shared some of my family's situation with her during our work together, so she understood more than most about what was happening. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, she said, I want to tell you about your daughter. 3 years ago, when I was trying to go back to school and work 2 jobs and raise my teenager, Sarah didn't just help me find job training programs. She drove me to interviews when my car broke down. She helped me practice presentations when I was too scared to speak in front of strangers. She believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Carmen's voice grew stronger as she continued. Sarah never asked me about my immigration status, or my divorce, or why I was starting over at 40. She just saw someone who needed support, and she provided it. Not because she had to, not because it looked good on a charity report, but because that's who she is. She looked directly at my parents. Your daughter is the kind of person who creates community wherever she goes. She's the kind of person who sees people who are struggling and finds ways to help them find their strength. If you're upset that she used those gifts to create something beautiful instead of sitting home alone, feeling sorry for herself, then maybe you need to think about what kind of family you want to be. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different, expectant rather than tense. My parents stood in my living room, surrounded by evidence of the life I'd built, the community I'd created, the love I'd cultivated through authenticity rather than performance. My father spoke first, his voice quieter than I'd heard it all day. Sarah, we came here because we thought you were trying to hurt us. We thought this was about revenge, or embarrassment, or making a point about our family. He looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had been strangers to him an hour ago, but who had just shared their stories with remarkable openness. We didn't understand that this was about healing. My mother was crying now, though she was trying to hide it. When she spoke, her voice was shakier than I'd ever heard it. I've spent so much of my life worried about what people would think, about whether we were successful enough, respected enough, perfect enough. I forgot that the point of having people in your life isn't to impress them, it's to care for them. She looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. I'm sorry, Sarah. We were wrong to uninvite you from Thanksgiving. We were wrong to prioritize our comfort over your well-being. We were wrong to assume that your strength meant you didn't need our support. The apology hung in the air between us, more complete and honest than anything I'd expected to hear from her. Margaret Wilson, who had been quietly observing from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with her characteristic combination of warmth and practicality. Margaret, there's enough food here to feed twice as many people as we have. If you'd like to stay and see what your daughter has created, you're welcome at our table. My parents looked at each other, having one of those wordless conversations that couples develop over decades of marriage. Finally, my mother nodded. We'd like that very much. What followed was unlike any family gathering I'd ever experienced. My parents sat at my mismatched table, eating food prepared by people they'd never met, listening to stories from lives completely different from their own. I watched my father ask Thomas Chen about his volunteer work, genuinely interested in the answer. I saw my mother help Carmen's daughter Sophia with her college application essay, offering advice that had nothing to do with social status and everything to do with authentic achievement. As the afternoon wore on, the boundaries between my chosen family and my biological family began to blur. My parents weren't performing anymore, weren't trying to manage impressions or control narratives. They were just two people sharing a meal with other people who had learned that community comes from vulnerability rather than perfection. The most surprising moment came when my mother asked Eleanor Rodriguez for her tres leches cake recipe, not because she wanted to impress anyone at her next dinner party, but because she genuinely loved the story Eleanor had shared about learning to bake from her grandmother in El Salvador. Family recipes aren't just about food, Eleanor told her, writing down ingredients on the back of a napkin. They're about carrying forward the love of people who came before us. As evening approached and guests began to leave, my parents helped with cleanup without being asked. We worked together in comfortable quiet, the three of us moving around my small kitchen with an ease I couldn't remember ever feeling in their house. When the last guest had gone and the dishes were done, we sat in my living room with cups of coffee and leftover pie, finally ready to have the conversation we'd been avoiding for months. I need you to understand something, I told them. I didn't create this dinner to hurt you, or embarrass you, or prove that I was better than the family traditions we grew up with. I created it because I needed to discover what community could feel like when it was based on choice rather than obligation. My father nodded slowly. We understand that now, and Sarah, we need you to understand something too. We've been proud of you your entire life, but we never learned how to show pride in anything that looked different from what we expected. Your strength, your independence, your willingness to start over when things didn't work out, these aren't failures. They're the qualities that make you remarkable. My mother reached over and took my hand. I kept that photo of you in the chef's hat, because even when you were 10 years old, I could see that you had something special. Not the kind of special that looks good on Christmas cards, but the kind that makes people's lives better just by being around you. She squeezed my fingers.
I was scared that if I celebrated those qualities too much, you'd outgrow us. You'd become someone so remarkable that you wouldn't need us anymore. So I kept pushing you toward achievements I understood instead of celebrating the person you actually were. The irony, my father added, is that by trying to keep you close, we pushed you away. And by pushing you away, we missed the chance to see you create something more beautiful than anything we ever imagined. As they prepared to leave, my mother paused at the door. Sarah, would you consider having Christmas dinner with us this year? Not the big production with everyone we think we should invite, but something smaller, something real. Just family, my father added, and then corrected himself. Just the people who matter most to us. I hugged them both goodbye, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were actually seeing each other clearly. After they left, I sat alone in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the lingering warmth of the day, processing everything that had happened. The dinner I'd planned as an alternative to family tradition had somehow become the catalyst for creating a new kind of family entirely. I realized that the community I'd built wasn't separate from my biological family or in competition with it. It was the foundation that had made it possible for us to find each other again, to rebuild our relationship on authenticity rather than expectation. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from fixing what's broken, but from having the courage to create something entirely new. And sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who need to see you build that new thing before they can understand what they almost lost. That night, I started planning Christmas dinner, knowing it would be different from anything we'd done before, but excited to discover what our family could become when we stopped performing and started connecting. The greatest gift isn't proving others wrong about who you are. It's having the courage to live so authentically that they can't help but see who you've always been. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crisp winter sunlight that makes everything look like it's been dusted with possibility. I stood in my parents' kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd spent countless childhood mornings, but everything felt different now. The counters were covered with ingredients for recipes we'd never made together before. Dishes that told stories of the people who had become part of our expanded definition of family. My mother was carefully following Eleanor Rodriguez's handwritten instructions for tres leches cake, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, flowers streaking her expensive sweater. She looked younger somehow, more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. The cream isn't thickening the way Eleanor said it would, she said, worry creeping into her voice. It takes patience, I told her, remembering Eleanor's gentle correction when I'd made the same mistake during our practice session the week before. Keep whisking, trust the process. My father was in the living room with Thomas Chen, both of them laughing about something related to the chess game they'd been playing via email since Thanksgiving. Thomas had become a regular presence in my parents' lives over the past month, stopping by for weekly dinners and bringing stories that had helped my father understand that grief and joy could coexist in the same heart. The guest list for Christmas dinner was smaller but somehow felt more significant than any gathering my parents had ever hosted. Carmen and Sophia were coming, along with Margaret Wilson and her adult daughter who was visiting from Portland. Vivian Watson would be there, bringing her famous green bean casserole and probably more wisdom than any of us deserved. Michael Pemberton had accepted our invitation, still navigating his own path through divorce but no longer facing the holidays alone. But the most meaningful addition to our table was Jennifer, my sister-in-law, who had quietly separated from David 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. She'd moved into a small apartment across town with my nephew and niece, finally finding the courage to acknowledge that her perfect marriage had been as much of a performance as everything else in our family had been. I kept thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving, she'd told me over coffee the previous week. About community being based on choice rather than obligation. I realized I'd been choosing to stay in a relationship that made me feel invisible because I thought that was what family loyalty looked like. David hadn't taken the separation well. He'd blamed me initially, suggesting that my rebellion against family expectations had somehow infected his wife with dangerous ideas about independence. But after several difficult conversations with our parents,
who had surprised everyone by supporting Jennifer's decision, he was beginning to understand that authenticity wasn't contagious defiance. It was simply the courage to live in alignment with your values. The doorbell rang at exactly noon, and I watched my parents exchange one of their wordless looks before my father went to answer it. But instead of the warm greetings I expected to hear, there was a moment of surprised silence. I walked to the foyer to find my brother David standing on the threshold, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "David," my father said carefully, "we weren't expecting you. I know, I probably should have called first." He looked past my father to where I was standing, then at my mother, who had emerged from the kitchen with flowers still on her hands. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Jennifer moved out. About family, and expectations, and what it means to show up for the people you care about." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him against the December cold. "I realized that I've never actually shown up for Sarah. Not when she got divorced, not when you uninvited her from Thanksgiving, not even when she created something beautiful from all that pain." My mother wiped her hands on her apron, leaving white streaks on the red fabric. "David, we're having a different kind of Christmas dinner this year. It might not be what you're used to." "That's exactly why I need to be here," he said. "I need to understand what you've all discovered that I've been too stubborn to see." What followed was unlike any family gathering I'd ever imagined possible. David sat at our table, listening to stories from people whose lives bore no resemblance to the surgical precision of his own existence. He asked Carmen about her accounting degree with genuine interest, engaged Thomas in conversation about volunteer work, helped Sophia with her college application essays with the same attention he gave to medical research. But the most profound moment came when Jennifer arrived with my nephew and niece. The children ran to their father immediately, as children do, but there was a new dynamic between David and Jennifer that spoke of respect rather than obligation. "Thank you for coming," Jennifer said to David quietly, and I could see years of unspoken tension beginning to dissolve. "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like," he replied, and I realized that my brother was finally beginning to understand the difference between fixing problems and supporting people through them. As we gathered around the table, my father cleared his throat in the way he always did before making important announcements. But instead of the formal toast I expected, he simply said, "This year we're grateful for second chances." My mother added, "And for learning that family isn't about being perfect together, it's about being real together." The conversation that followed was everything I'd dreamed family dinners could be. Stories were shared without performance, laughter came easily, and disagreements were met with curiosity rather than defense. Michael Pemberton talked about the loneliness of divorce, with a vulnerability that made space for others to share their own struggles. Margaret Wilson described her husband's death with both grief and gratitude, showing us that loss and love weren't opposites but dance partners. Sophia, who had been quiet for most of the meal, suddenly spoke up during dessert. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something?" My mother nodded, probably expecting a question about college or career advice. "How did you learn to stop being afraid of what people think?" The question hung in the air with surprising weight. My mother set down her fork and considered her answer carefully. "I haven't completely learned that yet, Sophia. But what I've discovered is that the opinions that matter most are the ones that come from people who know who you really are, not who you're trying to appear to be." She looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over the past month. "These people have seen me make mistakes, struggle with recipes, cry over family problems, and learn to apologize when I'm wrong. Their opinions matter because they're based on truth rather than performance." David had been listening intently to this exchange. "Can I ask you something, Mom?" She nodded. "When did you realize that what Sarah was doing wasn't about rejecting our family, but about creating the kind of family she needed?" My mother was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered her voice was softer than usual. "When I watched all these people defend her at Thanksgiving without being asked to. When I realized that she had inspired the kind of loyalty that can't be purchased or performed. When I understood that everything I thought I was protecting by excluding her was actually meaningless without her in it. After dinner, as we cleaned up together, my father pulled me aside for a private conversation in his study, the same room where he'd delivered countless lectures about responsibility and expectations throughout my childhood. "Sarah, I need to tell you something I've never said out loud before." He sat heavily in his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "Your mother and I came to this country with nothing but ambition and fear. Everything we built was motivated by the terror of losing what we'd worked so hard to achieve. We thought that if we could just accumulate enough success, enough respect, enough social standing, we'd finally feel secure." He gestured toward the wall covered with diplomas and awards, photos from charity galas and business achievements, but all of that was external validation. "We never learned how to feel worthy from the inside. So we pushed you and David to achieve things that would reflect well on us, thinking that your success would somehow prove that we deserved our place in this community." He looked directly at me. "What you did with Thanksgiving, and what you've helped us create here today, is something I never knew was possible. A sense of belonging that doesn't depend on performance or achievement, or the approval of people who don't really know us." "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. I need to say this." He leaned forward. "You've shown us what it looks like to build community based on authenticity rather than aspiration. You've demonstrated that love doesn't have to be earned or maintained through perfect behavior. You've created something that's made me feel more at home in my own life than I've felt in 40 years in this country." He stood up and walked over to his desk, opening a drawer and pulling out a framed photograph I'd never seen before. It showed me at maybe 7 years old, standing in their first tiny apartment kitchen, stirring something in a pot that was almost too big for me to handle, grinning at the camera with pure joy. "Your mother and I have spent so much energy trying to forget where we came from, trying to distance ourselves from the struggle and uncertainty of those early years. But looking at this picture, I remember that some of our happiest moments were in that cramped little kitchen, cooking together, dreaming about the future, grateful for what we had rather than worried about what we lacked." He handed me the photograph. "What you've done is help us remember that the best parts of our life together weren't about achieving status or impressing people. They were about connection, about care, about showing up for each other authentically." That evening, as guests began to leave, each person lingered longer than usual, reluctant to break the spell of genuine connection we'd created. Hugs lasted longer, promises to stay in touch felt more substantial, and the quiet that settled over the house after everyone left was peaceful rather than empty. Jennifer stayed to help with the final cleanup, and as we worked together in the kitchen, she shared something that surprised me. "David asked me yesterday if I thought we could work things out, if we could rebuild our marriage on the foundation of what he's learned from watching you create authentic community." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that I'm not interested in rebuilding what we had, because what we had was never real. But I might be interested in building something entirely new, something based on who we actually are, rather than who we thought we were supposed to be." She dried a wineglass carefully before continuing. "I told him that the only way I'd consider it is if he could prove that he's committed to the kind of growth that involves risk and vulnerability, and the possibility of being wrong about things he's believed his whole life. That's a lot to ask of someone. It's everything to ask of someone, and if he's not ready for that, then I'd rather be alone and authentic than coupled and pretending." As I drove home that night, my car filled with leftovers, and my heart full of gratitude I couldn't have imagined a year ago, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. The divorce that had felt like failure had actually been the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of my life. The family rejection that had seemed like the end of belonging had actually been the catalyst for creating belonging that was deeper and more genuine than anything I'd known before. But most importantly, I'd learned that the courage to live authentically doesn't just change your own life. It gives other people permission to examine their own choices, to question their own assumptions, to risk their own transformation. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation that surprised me more than any piece of mail I'd ever opened. David and Jennifer were renewing their vows, but the ceremony they described bore no resemblance to their original wedding. Small gathering, handwritten vows, focus on commitment rather than celebration, invitation extended only to people who knew them well enough to understand what this second chance meant. At the bottom of the invitation, Jennifer had handwritten a note, Thank you for showing us that sometimes you have to break apart completely before you can build something real. I smiled, thinking about all the ways that breaking apart had led to building something real, not just for me, but for everyone who had found the courage to choose authenticity over appearance. The greatest gift you can give your family isn't perfect behavior or impressive achievement. It's the courage to live so authentically that you inspire them to risk authenticity too. Sometimes love means disappointing people's expectations so you can exceed their dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.